It's good to, well, I say good to be here. It's good to be here in a virtual space. It's been looking forward to the talk and have a nice discussion as well. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get started, shall we? Okay. Okay. Can everyone see this? Is that all right? Can you see that? Excellent.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's coming on now. Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, so yes, this is the Unhomely Mind. So thank you very much to Perry, the public programs manager here, and our research manager Tom as well for the invitation to speak tonight. What I want to talk to you about tonight kind of draws upon the central preoccupations of the doctoral research that I've done. So the psychic and social conditions that allow conspiratorial reasoning to take hold, and what the psychoanalytic tradition, and in particular the work of Freud and Melanie Klein, might offer in terms of understanding that process. The core question the work I've done recently has sought to address is, on the initial basis, quite a deceptively simple question. Why do conspiracy theories feel so compelling? Not merely just what people believe, but what function those beliefs actually serve beneath the surface of rhetoric and beneath the surface of the political claims themselves, at the level of affect or psychic need, of what one could observe as the inner emotional architecture of the individual and the group. So this is the structure of the talk. This is the structure of the slides that I'm going to be presenting today. The unhomely, sort of Freud's unheimlich and the psychic displacement, Freudian foundations, the persecution, splitting and fabricated connection, Klein and the paranoid schizoid position, then the online community, stickers, telegrams and conspiratorial reasoning, effective discharge of violent ideation, and then moving towards the depressive position, and reflections on that. So it can be looked at that in a period of genuine social upheaval or societal upheaval, during the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, it represented one of the more significant crises, of the contemporary age. Conspiratorial reasoning doesn't emerge as an irrational aberration, rather as one can analyze through a psychoanalytic lens. It comes to the fore as a response to something felt at the deepest affective registers of human experience, a loss of psychic coherence, of belonging, of predictable reality. It's that loss, I've found, a disquieting sense of not being at home in one's own world, to which this paper kind of turns, with its presentation turns, its central organizing concept. So the empirical grounding of this, I'll get onto this next slide in a second, for this argument rests in the examination of a group called the White Rose. They weren't a UK-based anti-lockdown movement. They were a global anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine conspiracy network, operating on two primary media forms. There was the study I did was a localized Dorset Telegram community, the social media channel, and as well as a corpus of approximately 75 to 80 physical conspiracy stickers collected from the environment in Bournemouth. And I wonder, on a side note, if my own manic defense during COVID-19 was going around collecting stickers off of lampposts as a way to feel some sense of control over my surroundings. But this isn't the time to psychoanalyze myself. There's plenty more to look at. So those two data sets, analysed through a combined psychosocial and a semiotic framework, allowed me to examine conspiratorial reasoning as it manifested in communicative practice, rather than an abstract belief, instead as a lived, performed and affectively charged discourse. So the central concept through which the paper is organised is this notion of the unhomely. Das unheimlich, and that's probably the extent of my German, really, is that. So the unheimlich and the loss of a psychic home. The concept of the unheimlich, translated as the uncanny generally, or as I quite like, the unhomely, acts to illuminate a particular kind of psychic experience, the experience of encountering something that's simultaneously familiar and strange, something that ought to belong to the realm of the known and the safe, and yet which comes to feel threatening or alien or disquieting. In Freud's essay, he traced this through aesthetics and literature in 1919, but you could argue its more modern or a more potent application of this is in the domain of political psychology and social psychology. This concept of the home, as one can observe it operating within a psychoanalytic tradition, is a core psychic construct. The sense of coherence, belonging, and predictable reality within which the ego operates with a degree of security. It's an internal space within which one feels, employing a phrase that carries particular resonance in psychoanalytic context, held. Um, when that internal space is disrupted, when the conditions of everyday life begin to feel uncertain, when trust in institutions erodes, and when the boundaries of self and world feel unstable, one experiences what is to be unhomely. Um, as a result of that disruption, I found that individuals don't tend to tolerate that ambiguity, and this is where Klein comes in, and move on from that. They embark on what one could observe as a search for new forms of psychic anchoring, of new objects around which coherence can be organized. It could be argued the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic represented one of the most acute instances of this kind of psychic displacement in living memory. It was one of those things that impacted everybody globally. There was everybody on the planet was affected by COVID-19, and it kind of became a landmark event. So many times I speak to people about certain things I've done or places I've been, and I've said, "Oh, this was before COVID. This was BC." It's kind of a mark, a bookend, or a chapter in sort of human history, really, which I find very fascinating as well. Um, Apologies. So the circumstances of that period, sort of mass mortality, governmental restriction of movement and social life, economic precarity, the erosion of trusted public health institutions in certain quarters, all acted to create a widespread affective disruption that comes to the fore as a fertile ground for conspiratorial reasoning. But it would be a theoretical and empirical error to locate the conditions of conspiratorial vulnerability solely within the pandemic itself. The pandemic, you can argue, acted as a catalyst for these anxieties that already characterized the public mood of contemporary Britain. Not to get too politically charged here, but you could say that decades of neoliberal erosion of social solidarity, intensifying economic inequality, the decline of trusted public institutions, and the affective precarity produced by increasingly fragmented social bonds, all of those factors within which conspiratorial potential was already building, came to the fore with particular intensity during the period under examination, the COVID-19 pandemic specifically. So that's at that juncture where one encounters that question that drives the remainder of this talk, really. What precisely does conspiratorial reasoning offer to those experiencing this kind of psychic displacement? How might the Freudian and Kleinian traditions help to illuminate? So there's it's lit my face up, this new bright screen that suddenly I can see again. So to address those questions, you can first turn to Freud, and an appropriate museum to be doing so. In particular, what might be regarded as an underappreciated dimension of his theoretical corpus, I think, his analysis of persecution and totemic structures, psychological mechanisms through which groups organize themselves around shared objects of veneration and horror. In Totem and Taboo, Freud offered a foundational account of how the psyche manages its ambivalence towards authority figures. Drawing on his analysis of totemic cultures, Freud identified that the mind comes to be, as he termed it, split up into the two forms into which it later develops, veneration and horror. Freud recognized that within totemic structures, figures of authority come to be understood either as protectors, idealized objects of devotion, or as persecutory figures upon whom all misfortune can be projected. As such, the ambivalence inherent in all relationships with power, it could be argued, is managed through that binary that reduces complexity to a perceivable clarity. You can observe this mechanism operating with particular visibility in conspiratorial discourse. The notion that a satanic cabal of powerful elites controls the mechanisms of governments and public health. It's a narrative one encounters specifically when going through these conspiratorial materials that that I studied, one of the messages that I looked at claimed that the depopulation of human masses is the arch objective of the deep state, which amplifies that structure. It represents precisely this kind of totemic splitting Freud identified. Um, the governmental figure is raised in Freud's formulation to the rank of a father in an all-powerful entity upon whom all suffering can be blamed. Critically, this process is not experienced as irrational by those within it. Freud observed that if the mind is unable to establish a true connection, it doesn't hesitate to fabricate a false one. It can be posited that this fabrication of connection, the drawing of causal chains between disparate events, the perceived revelation of hidden patterns that others can't see, serves a core psychic function. It acts to restore a sense of meaning and agency in conditions where both can feel lost. A conspiracy theorist in this reading is not wrong. They're performing a psychic operation designed to manage the affective consequences of powerlessness. Freud's analysis of religious belief in the future of an illusion extends this understanding further. Freud argued that illusions, beliefs in which wish fulfillment constitutes a primary element of motivation, serve to manage what he described as the destructive, antisocial tendencies present in all human beings. What comes to the fore in conspiratorial reasoning, you can argue, is a secular variant of this illusory process, a wish fulfillment operation through the construction of a world in which one possesses special insight, special knowledge, and special resistance against the machinations of a persecutory elite. Owing to this, the appeal of conspiratorial belief cannot be addressed through the provision of counter-evidence alone. As Karen Douglas at the University of Kent confirmed within conspiratorial research literature, conspiracy theories function as a means through which individuals reclaim a perceived sense of control. The cognitive dimension of conspiratorial reasoning, the specific contents of the beliefs, is in this analysis secondary to the affective function that those beliefs can serve. So this is when I move on to Klein and the paranoid schizoid position, anxiety splitting, construction of persecutory objects. Mary Klein's theoretical contributions allow for a more granular account of this specific psychic mechanisms through which conspiratorial reasoning operates. Klein's framework, developed in her work on the paranoid schizoid position, offers what one can analyze as a micropsychology of the mechanisms Freud identified at the macro level. I'm just going to move this so I can be a bit more visible, and you realize it's slowly darkening around. Okay, that's not going to work. I'm going to carry on. Klein argued that the earliest and most fundamental forms of anxiety, what she termed persecutory anxiety, involves the experience of external reality as threatening, fragmented, and hostile. In the paranoid schizoid position, the ego defends itself against this anxiety through a series of interrelated operations, splitting objects into wholly good and wholly bad poles, projecting internal anxiety, aggression, and destructive impulses onto external figures who are then experienced as persecutory, and employing denial to eliminate from awareness those realities too threatening to be integrated. These operations, Klein understood, were not pathological in origin. They characterized early developmental experience. However, they can be returned to under conditions of sufficient anxiety at any point in your lifespan. I think that's quite an important point to note, really. Klein often spoke about this in relation to children, but if you examine the core tenets of the paranoid schizoid position, splitting, binary oppositions, projection, projective identification, idealization, we all slip into it. I often use an example of whenever a bus is late, I immediately say all buses are always late all the time, forever. They're never on time. And that's me slipping momentarily into that all or nothing mindset, perceiving the buses as a persecutory object. So the relevance of that framework to conspiratorial reasoning, then, I argue, is quite considerable. Observing the white rose materials, the conspiratorial materials, is a sustained operation of those mechanisms. The splitting element in that sense comes to the fore clearly in the consistent reduction of the political sphere to absolute binary oppositions. One of the messages I looked at, for instance, characterized vaccination as a medical tyranny imposed by corrupt jabbers, which is maybe a good name for a band, I think. Maybe Tom Perry could start that band. the corrupt jabbers. Well, another message divides political actors into those who are on the right side of humanity and those who are not. There is, as Eve Sedgwick identifies in her analysis on paranoid reading, an insistence on all or nothing, an inability to comprehend or tolerate ambivalence that characterizes paranoid schizoid functioning and comes to the fore as the fundamental I can never pronounce this word. I don't know why I've written it. Estip- Epistemological orientation of conspiratorial discourse. I will try and avoid that word in future for time purposes. The projection element is equally visible. One of our other messages, message 5, in this conversation, it's narrative posited that vaccines are being placed into animals and livestock in order to shed into unvaccinated populations and eventually will all be slaughtered. This represents not a calculated assessment of empirical evidence, but an externalization of existential dread. Feelings of powerlessness, vulnerability, and an annihilation anxiety are projected onto a constructed persecutory object, the amorphous elite. Which is thereupon experienced as the source of that dread. Excuse me, sorry. This process, Supporter argued, represents externalizing hate and destructiveness as an alternative formulation of the social construct of the enemy. What one can observe as particularly significant in the Kleinian framework is the concept of projective identification, the means in which, having projected internal anxiety onto an external object, the individual comes to identify that object so thoroughly with the projected quality that the original internal origin of the anxiety is lost to awareness. The governmental authority, the medical establishment, and unnamed these perceived persecutory figures come to be experienced not as receiving projections, but as genuinely embodying the malevolence attributed towards them. Thus, the conspiratorial worldview becomes self-reinforcing. Evidence that might challenge it is reinterpreted as further confirmation of the persecutory agenda. And I think it's important to observe this concept of denial as well. It's not just denial of specific facts, but what Klein terms massive denial, wholesale rejection of entire structures of reality. Another message 22 in the White Rose Conversations, had a great reformulation wherein the severity of COVID-19 wasn't necessarily all that was attributed in terms of denial, but the entire viral theory of disease is denied, replaced by a notion of toxic poisoning. And it represented this operation in its most thoroughgoing form. And such comprehensive denial allows for the construction of an alternative reality where the paranoid schizoid narrative can operate without interruption. What conspiratorial reasoning offers, therefore, in Kleinian terms, is a form of psychic retreat, a return to the modes of functioning associated with paranoid schizoid position, where anxiety is managed at the cost of complexity. The world becomes legible again, simplified into us and them, good and evil, enlightened resistors and malevolent persecutors. The affective cost of genuine ambiguity is exchanged for a temporary relief, and that comes with perceived certainty. Oh, you can suddenly see me again. The construction of a paranoid home, then, stickers, telegram, and a conspiratorial media ecology. So having established this theoretical framework, you can then turn to the means in which these psychic operations manifest in the materials under examination. I should really have put in some stickers here, which for some reason I didn't do. But feel free to imagine them as powerfully as you can. The relationship between physical sticker campaigns and the Telegram community, this relationship represents a form of what Jacob Johansen terms paranoid schizoid technology, a media ecology designed, whether consciously or not, to facilitate and amplify the mechanisms described. The stickers, I found about 75 to 80 in total, were deployed across Bournemouth's built environment during the period under study, and they function as condensed affective statements. Drawing on the work of Judith Williamson in 1978, her work on the psychology of advertising, you can observe these stickers as operating in a manner directly analogous to commercial images, not by presenting an argument, but by interpolating the viewer into pre-existing ideological position, by speaking to anxieties the viewer already carries, and by offering a framework within which those anxieties can be organized. Judith Williamson observed that advertisements work because we collude in their working. Conspiracy stickers then, can be argued, function on precisely that basis. They don't persuade the indifferent, rather they resonate with those in whom the affective conditions for conspiratorial identification are already present. The semiotic operations through which this interpolation occurs are consistent with Kleinian splitting mechanisms. The stickers employ this stark monochromatic contrast. They're black and white. Prohibition symbols, images of masked children, and visual grammar that reduces complex realities to immediate affective binaries. A syringe framed by a prohibition sign doesn't invite rational deliberation necessarily, but it positions vaccination as an unambiguous all bad object. It invokes anxiety and a bodily threat. And it's important to note that this condensation of meaning into simple, immediately recognizable symbols, it is ideologically coherent, I'd argue, with the paranoid schizoid orientation that these materials express. The relationship between the physical stickers and the Telegram community is an interesting one, I found. Each sticker carried a QR code directing viewers to the Telegram group, effectively functioning in a sense as a recruitment advertisement. Orcock in 2022 characterized this as a spatial activism, a claim upon public space as ideological terrain. And owing to that, this sticker campaign and the digital community constitute what one could describe as a complementary media ecology. The stickers perform the affective trigger in the external world. The Telegram community then provides space for collective affective discharge, narrative elaboration, and a mutual reinforcement of paranoid schizoid defenses. The Dorset White Rose Telegram group had 271 members in at the time of data collection, and it exhibited what became an interesting and quite distinctive communicative quality, what might be described as an alone togetherness. Participants rarely actually engaged in sustained dialogue with each other. Rather, each post functioned as an independent assertion of opinion, a discharge of affect into a shared space that affirmed belonging without requiring genuine reciprocity. This quality resonated with Bion's analysis of group dynamics, wherein the shared affect of the group embers, fear, anger, determination, acts as the primary bonding force, replacing genuine object relations with the maintenance of a collective paranoid schizoid state. Affective discharge, violence ideation, and the limits of the paranoid home. It's important to examine one of the more concerning elements of the findings, an escalation within the Telegram discourse from affective discharge to explicit violent ideation. This escalation represents a logical endpoint, I suppose, of paranoid schizoid functioning, which, when left unchecked by a corrective capacity of the depressive position, can form. And within the Telegram materials, one can trace a clear trajectory. There was an assertion that the person who wrote the comment in message 4 had already lost a very good job owing to the refusal of the death shot, marked by repeated exclamation marks, indicating that intensity, and represents the refusal of this perceived tyranny as an act of individual agency. Another message 10, had an instruction that if we are denied access due to being unvaxxed, an attack on one is an attack on all. At that point, we must stampede the place. Represents this shift from splitting to violent enactment. This imagery of a stampede is not incidental, I'd argue, perhaps. It signals a regression to a pre-verbal instinctual mode of response consistent with what Klein would identify as the most primitive operations of paranoid schizoid functioning. And message 18 had a casual proposal to hang all the politicians and evil entities that control this monopoly, and perhaps represents the most extreme manifestation of that trajectory. A collective normalization of violent ideation as acceptable political discourse. Moskalenko documented in their analysis of QAnon, conspiratorial narratives can correlate with support for radical political action and insurrection. Understanding the psychological mechanisms underlying this escalation is not just an academic exercise, but it speaks directly to the capacity of conspiratorial movements to motivate political violence. What one can observe in these moments is the consequence of a psychic structure that has constructed a paranoid home, a coherent though distorted reality, but this has done so at the cost of a capacity for the depressive positions, ambivalence, concern, and reparative impulse. When the external world is wholly split into persecutors and resistance, when anxiety has been projected onto malevolent others or in denial has eliminated a possibility of doubt, in such conditions, violence can be experienced not as a moral transgression, but as a righteous self-defense. So towards the depressive position, Klein's depressive position, characterized by the capacity for ambivalence, concern for the other, guilt, the recognition that the same object can be both good and bad, represents in Kleinian developmental theory a psychological achievement that requires conditions of relative security, the ability to tolerate complexity, to understand uncertainty without retreating into binary oppositions, to recognize one's own destructive impulses alongside one's loving ones. These are capacities, Klein argued, that depend upon a sufficient degree of psychic safety. It can be posited that the conditions of contemporary political and economic life in Britain, the precarity produced by decades of neoliberal policy, erosion of democratic participation, and the fragmentation of social life, create circumstances within which the depressive position becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. And Dr. Amy Allen argues that Klein's work provides a more fully developed account of the fundamental role played by aggression in human psychological and social life. And one can observe in the White Rose materials how this aggression, lacking the integrative container of depressive position functioning, discharges itself through conspiratorial channels. The implications of this analysis for how one might respond to conspiratorial reasoning are, I'd argue, potentially quite significant. Attempts to counter conspiracies through the provision of factual information or logical argumentation will often prove insufficient if conspiratorial reason is affective rather than cognitive. As Karen Douglas wrote, conspiracy theories appear to satisfy emotional needs and restore senses of perceived control, functions that rational counter-argument cannot adequately address. So addressing conspiratorial reasoning may require attention not merely to the specific beliefs themselves, but to the affective and material circumstances within which those beliefs emerge and persist. It's important at this juncture to acknowledge that the individuals attracted to White Rose narratives are responding to genuine experiences of powerlessness, genuine anxieties about governmental overreach, genuine uncertainties about the nature of authority. Dismissing these concerns as irrationality and pathologizing conspiratorial belief without attending to its social and political substrate risks reproducing the very conditions of that psychic displacement that allow conspiratorial reasoning to hold in the public sphere. So let me close then by returning to this concept within which the paper opened, this presentation opened, the unhomely, the unheimlich. The conspiratorial mind, as one can analyze it through a Freudian and Kleinian framework, is characterized by a core experience of psychic displacement, of feeling estranged in one's own inner world, encountering one's own society as threatening, alien, and persecutory. In response to this displacement, conspiratorial reasoning offers what it can be argued as a distortive, though emotionally compelling substitute for genuine psychic security. A paranoid home consisting through splitting, projection, and denial, within which anxiety is managed at the cost of complexity. This paranoid home is rigid, defended, and ultimately self-reinforcing. It precludes the genuine integration of ambivalence, the tolerance for uncertainty, and the reparative impulse towards the other that Klein identified as the core elements of the depressive position functioning, and that one could observe as the psychological preconditions for genuine democratic participation and collective resilience. The means in which one addresses the unhomely mind, therefore, cannot come to the fore through argument alone. It requires attention to the affective conditions within which the psychic displacement occurs, to the political and economic circumstances that produce that precarity and powerlessness, to the erosion of social bonds within which belonging and meaning are constructed, and to the creation of conditions wherein citizens may feel sufficiently secure to tolerate the genuine uncertainty and complexity of political life. The question this research ultimately poses is not simply why do people believe conspiracy theories, but it could be argued in more fundamental questions about the conditions of psychic life in the contemporary political sphere. What does it mean to feel at home in the world? What happens when that sense of home is lost? And what kind of work, political, social, and psychoanalytic, might be required in order to construct genuine forms of belonging in its place? Thank you.